Good afternoon. I'm Mike Van Dusen, Deputy Director of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. A hearty welcome to all of you. Thank you for being here for this book launch. I wanted to acknowledge the presence of Congressman Chris Van Hollen of the 8th District of Maryland, state of Maryland, and his wife Catherine Wilkins Van Hollen. Chris was one of the leaders on behalf of the Maryland delegation, and we appreciate everything he did in the course of the story, the Washington story behind this book. I also want to acknowledge the chairman of the Board of Trustees of the Woodrow Wilson Center, Ambassador Joe Gildenhorn and Elma Gildenhorn, for being here. Sandra Gerber, the vice chair of the Board of Trustees of the Woodrow Wilson Center, is also here. And of course, I want to recognize the Woodrow Wilson Center's president and director, Lee Hamilton and Nancy Hamilton, are here. Finally, Hala's family. Her husband, Dr. Shaul Bakash, and their daughter, Hale Bakash. This is a bittersweet occasion. Despite the marvelous and happy ending of Hala's incarceration in August 2007, when she was released from prison and allowed to travel, Hala's wonderful and gripping book brings back horrible memories we had during her 8-month ordeal. 4 months of virtual house arrest in her mother's apartment, followed by 4 months of confinement in the notorious Evin prison in Tehran. The story from Washington during this time was an extraordinary international effort to bring Hala back. Her many friends, her colleagues, her former students, so many of the people she touched in one way or another, rallied to help. I especially would like to recognize and to thank again many of those who helped. Congressman Chris Van Hollen, members of the Free Hale movement, members of the media, who continued to keep Hala's situation alive in print and on television and the radio. My colleagues here at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and the numerous individuals who wrote letters, signed petitions, participated in rallies, and called the Wilson Center constantly to offer help and support. Several of you are here today. We thank you again for your strong and unwavering support. There are also many officials and diplomats from here and around the globe who participated and made special efforts for Hale. Their strong support should be recognized as well. But that Washington story is not and should not be the story here today. We want to hear the story from over there in Iran, Hale's story. I'm delighted to turn the floor over to Ambassador Joe Gildenhorn, Chairman of the Board of Trustees of the Woodrow Wilson Center. Joe himself played a leadership role in the Washington side of this story. We are deeply appreciative of all he did. Mr. Chairman, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mike, for that very generous introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm just pleased that everybody could be here on this very special afternoon. I'm really delighted to recognize and introduce a very special woman, my colleague and good friend, Dr. Hala Esfandiari. Hala is an accomplished authoress who has currently written in haunting detail her experience as a captive of the Iranian government for over 8 months. For those who really have met Hala for the first time today, let me just briefly describe her extraordinary background. Hala is the director of our Middle East program here at the Wilson Center. And that program is very, very active and productive. She has produced most interesting and relevant programs on such subjects as the current Iranian political situation, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, women's rights, and democratic developments in the Middle East. It seems that Hala puts on a most interesting program just about every day. She excels in this role because she's not only an accomplished thinker, but also an accomplished doer. Hala grew up in Iran, leaving that country at the time of the 1979 Iranian Revolution. And while in Iran, she was an outstanding journalist and served as Secretary General of the Women's Organization of Iran. She was also deputy director of an Iranian cultural foundation, where she was responsible for the activities of several museums and art and cultural centers in that country. After leaving Iran, Hala taught Persian language and literature courses on the women's movement in Iran at Princeton University. And prior to her teaching at Princeton, she taught Persian language at Oxford University. Hala has written numerous books and articles and has been the recipient of many awards, including the MacArthur Foundation grant. In 2007, she received an annual award in Amman, Jordan, which was established in Hala's name by a group of business women and activists from the Middle East and North Africa countries. And she has also received an honorary degree from Georgetown University Law Center. As we all are aware, as Mike indicated, Hala was illegally detained by the Iranian government for over 8 months. She served 4 months of her incarceration in solitary confinement in the notorious Avon prison in Tehran. She was falsely accused of endangering Iranian national security and suffered intense and prolonged interrogation during her confinement. And after a global initiative to effectuate her release from prison, including a strong effort by numerous individuals, NGOs, and our own Woodrow Wilson Center, Hala was released from prison in August of 2007. Her courage in standing up to her accusers during her imprisonment has been an inspiration to everyone and is the subject of her new book entitled My Prison, My Home, One Woman's Story of Captivity in Iran. I believe this title succinctly describes her horrendous ordeal, and we now look forward to hearing from her. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my privilege and honor to recognize Hala Esfandiari.
Good afternoon, Mike, Joe. Thank you. I feel humbled by your kind words. Thank you to Lee and all my friends and colleagues at the Wilson Center for welcoming me back in September 2007 to my institutional home, the Wilson Center, after I was made unwelcome in my native land. I also owe thanks to those who joined the massive international campaign on my behalf to secure my freedom. I describe this effort in my book, yet hardly do justice to the hundreds of people, many of them in this room today, who took part in it. I would not be here today without them. But I also would like us to remember the many political detainees who remain in Iranian prison and for whose freedom we must continue to speak out. My special thanks goes to all my colleagues who made this event possible, and they know who they are. My Prison, My Home, whose publications we are marking today, is an account of my lengthy interrogation, arrest, and incarceration in Iran at the hands of Iran's intelligence ministry. It is also something more. I give an account in the book of an Iranian childhood, of growing up in the gentler, simpler Iran of the 1940s and 1950s. I touch on my working career. I was part of a new generation of professional women pursuing careers and pressing for more legal rights and our place in society. And I write about the revolution and the current clash between reform and reaction inside Iran's ruling class. The expanding authority of Iran's security services and the troubled relationship between Iran and the United States, because these form the background provide part of the explanation as to why I, on a simple visit to see my 93-year-old mother in Tehran, ended up in solitary confinement, accusing of trying to foment a velvet revolution. I will never forget either the early morning of December 30th, 2006, when I was stopped by knife-wielding men from leaving Iran, or the morning of May 8th, 5 months later, when after weeks of interrogation, I was arrested and incarcerated in Evin prison. May 8th was a glorious Tehran spring day for those of you in this audience who remember how beautiful spring is in Tehran. The sky was blue. The trees were bursting with fresh leaves and flowers were in bloom. Yet I was full of anxiety and premonition. I had been summoned yet again to the intelligence ministry, and the night before I had emailed my husband Shaul, I think they will take me in. A friend drove me to the intelligence ministry. He tried to cheer me up with black humor. "Don't worry," he said, "I will visit you at Evin prison and bring you lots of parcels." Minutes later, my interrogator handed me my arrest warrant, and within an hour, I was inside Evin prison. In my book, My Prison, My Home, I describe the process of being booked into Evin. I was blindfolded and led around by a female guard, a condition that became part of my daily life at Evin. Walking blindfolded, I discovered, is not only disorienting, it is also humiliating. You hear voices, footsteps, and sounds, but cannot quite place them. You worry that you will crack your head on a low beam or break your legs falling down unseen stairs. You are dependent on others like a child. The woman guard took me to my cell. I heard the door click shut, a quiet click that resounded in my head like thunder. I looked around the bare room. There was only a broken iron sink attached to one wall, and on the floor, a folded gray blanket and a copy of the Quran. High up on one wall were two rectangular barred windows through which I could see a bit of the sky, and near those windows on the ceiling were two fluorescent lights that remained on day and night. This was my new home. I even didn't have a watch to tell the time of the day. They had taken my watch and my purse, leaving me only my glasses and a hairbrush. My interrogation resumed that same afternoon. The interrogator, who had been an unwelcome presence in my life for 4 months, was joined at Evin by his superior, who went by the name of Haj Agha. At Evin, Haj Agha basically took over the interrogation. He was the boss. I was never allowed to see his face. When he was in the interrogation room, I had to sit facing the wall and talking to a concrete wall. He informed me that his bosses in the intelligence ministry were not satisfied with my responses outside prison. I had not cooperated, he said. I had not unraveled for them America's hidden agenda for regime change in Iran. I had not told them the truth about the role of the Wilson Center and Lee Hamilton in this plot. Tell us about the meeting you had with CIA, State and Defense Department officials in Mr. Hamilton's office. I'm sure Lee did not know how popular he is with the Iranian intelligence ministry. The tone of these interrogations, which sometimes lasted as long as 8 hours, was intimidating and menacing. I was taken before an investigating magistrate who ordered my detention in solitary confinement for 3 months on the charge of endangering the security of the country. Up to that moment, it had never occurred to me that I, a 67-year-old grandmother, barely 5 feet tall and weighing 105 pounds, could be a threat to the security of the most powerful country in the region. My interrogators told me they could keep me much longer, as long as necessary to make me talk. They threatened me with formal trial. They accused me of being a participant in America's conspiracy to overthrow the Islamic Republic. One day, they triumphantly produced a copy of the newspaper Kayhan, which in bold headlines proclaimed me and my husband to be Zionist spies. They invited me to confess, and I just ignored them, knowing quite well they could keep me in prison as long as they wished. Under President Ahmadinejad, the intelligence ministry has grown in power and influence. I lay out this process in some detail in my book. And under interrogation in Evin, I came to know more fully the paranoia that prevails in this intelligence ministry regarding Americans' intentions towards Iran. These men have persuaded themselves that the US is using think tanks, research centers, foundations, and even places like the Kennedy School at Harvard and the Hoover Institute at Stanford, the Carnegie Endowment for Peace, the National Endowment for Democracy, to lure and recruit Iranian academics, intellectuals, and journalists, and to encourage civil society groups for a project to bring about in Iran the same kind of a velvet revolution that overthrew regimes in the Ukraine and Georgia. They have also persuaded themselves that they alone can frustrate this plan. The rest of people like myself, the Iranian-American Kian Tajbakhsh, the Iranian-Canadian Ramin Jahanbeglu, who was, both of them were in prison, one before me and one with me, and many others like us, and the outlandish accusations made against us is aimed in part at persuading a skeptical Iranian public that they are right. My arrest and incarceration, I think, also illustrates an issue I discuss in my book. What can happen to innocent individuals caught in the conflict and rivalry between two states, Iran and the United States? These two countries were conducting a silent war with one another. I and many like me were caught in the crossfire. The intelligence ministry and the hardliners have now turned against their own erstwhile reformist colleagues within the leadership of the Islamic Republic. In the mass trial currently underway in Tehran and in the coerced televised confession we have all witnessed over the past months and even this morning, basically what we are seeing is the same scenario, this same twisted and dangerous mindset being played out on a national stage. The tactic of my interrogators at Evin was to try to wear me down and to try and catch me in a discrepancy by asking me the same questions over and over again, the tactic used by the KGB and the Stasi. Little did they know that I had read enough about East Germany to know what their tactics were. They, of course, had cut me off from the outside world. Until late in my imprisonment, I had no access to a newspaper or any news of the outside world. They tried to break my spirit. No one on the outside cares about you, Haj Agha once told me. They tried to engage me in a lengthy discussion regarding understanding of velvet and soft revolutions, the hegemonic role of America in the world, the relentless expansion of Islam as political force. I adamantly refused to get drawn into such discussions, claiming total ignorance about such matters. I had no desire to discuss in my interrogation room with my interrogators theories of revolution or the ideas of Michel Foucault and Frank Fukuyama. I didn't want inadvertently to say anything they could then use against me. My one aim was to get out of their clutches as quickly as possible. Very early in my incarceration, I decided I had to avoid giving in to despair. I determined to remain focused on the interrogation and stick to a disciplined routine that I devised for myself. Each evening, I carefully went over in my mind the day's interrogation, determining where my interrogators were headed, looking for the traps they were laying for me, reviewing over my own answers. I also prepared for the next day interrogation, anticipating questions, making sure I had all the facts clear and organized in my mind, devising my own strategies. Kept me quite busy. I had also to remain alert. One day, when I was taking my routine walk on one of the two rooftop terraces where prisoners were allowed for an hour a day, both, of course, were surrounded by high walls, I noticed a newspaper neatly propped against the wall. I could read the headline in bold black letters even as I walked. Mossad and CIA network uncovered. Cut off from all news, I was really tempted to pick up the newspaper, but I knew there were hidden cameras. I realized my interrogators wanted me to see and read this particular story. I continued going round and round the terrace, ignoring the newspaper. Later that day, my interrogator asked if I had seen anything interesting during my morning walk. I did see a newspaper lying there, I told the disappointed Haj Agha, but I didn't have my glasses and couldn't even read the headline. Eager for public confirmation of their theories regarding America's plans for a velvet revolution in Iran, my interrogators wanted me to speak on camera. I finally felt I had to agree. Even though I had no intention of making false statements, and I don't think I did, it was one of my worst moments at Evin. I was taped in a room in Evin, made up to look like a living room, and sat on a sofa speaking about my life and my work and think tanks in the US as if I was delivering a lecture at some open gathering. There was nothing to indicate I was under arrest. In solitary confinement, speaking from a prison. Although I said nothing that was untrue and implicated no one, at least I hope, afterwards I felt soiled, somehow dirtied by the experience. It was all a show. It was false, and I had no idea how the intelligence people would use and manipulate it for their own ends. That evening, I spent a long time under the shower, trying to wash off the taint of the interview from myself. During those long summer days in Evin, when the sun rose at 5 in the morning and set at 9 at night, there were still many hours to kill outside of the interrogations. I arranged for myself a rigorous exercise program. I used 2 plastic bottles of water as weights and did Pilates exercises. I exercised before breakfast and between breakfast and lunch. I used the 1 to 2 hours a day I was allowed on the rooftop terraces to pace rapidly back and forth. I also kept busy by writing 2 books in my head, editing them and moving around paragraphs and chapters. In the evening after dinner, I read whatever books was able to borrow from the prison library. Halfway through my stay, my fellow prisoner, Kian Tajbakhsh, who lived in Iran and could get books from home, shared his books with me, and I was able to feast on Dostoevsky and Graham Greene and Georges Simenon. But I had to ration my reading. I was denied my eye medication, and the light was on in my cell 24 hours a day and was damaging my eyesight. I was sleeping on 6 folded blankets on the floor and no pillow. And terrified of lice, I showered twice a day and washed my clothes on the outside terrace twice a day. I was allowed to call my mother very briefly, only 2 or 3 times a week, always in the presence of a guard. We could only exchange pleasantries. How are you? How are my grandchildren? How is my daughter? In the 105 days, I was granted 1 visit from my mother. She had become very frail. By then, having lost 20 pounds, I weighed only 85 pounds, and she even less. But in that meeting, she managed to tell me that efforts were being made on my behalf on the outside and that I should not give up hope. I made sure I never showed any sign of weakness to my interrogators. If I needed to cry, as on occasions I did that under the shower or in my bed at night. And despite my best effort, despair, which lurked in every corner of my prison cell, sometimes overcame me. For 4 months, I talked to no one except to my interrogators, my female guards, and an occasional prison doctor. The loneliness can become overwhelming. The idea of a trial and a long prison term was unbearable to me. One night, when I saw the full moon for the 3rd time through the ceiling window of my prison cell, I realized I had been in Evin for 3 months. It was then that I decided I will wait a bit longer and then go on a hunger strike if I were not freed. They will either let me die or let me go, I said to myself. It was at this juncture in early August that I sensed that there might be some movement in my case. My interrogator told me out of the blue that Mr. Hamilton had written a letter to Iran's leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, that a reply to that letter was now at the Iranian mission to the United Nations in New York, and that Mr. Hamilton should go to New York and take delivery of it. To convey the urgency they felt regarding this letter exchange, they allowed me for the first time to speak to my Austrian-born mother in German. I gave her the message, and 2 or 3 days later, Mother reported that Mr. Hamilton had taken the delivery of the letter and had replied to it. I don't know what the content of the letter was. I described these last 2 weeks in Evin in my book, an agonizing period of silence, as if nothing was happened. Then the day when Haj Agha summoned me to what I thought would be another tiresome interrogation session to tell me, "You are free, you can go." For a brief moment, I thought this is a cruel joke. They were very good at making such jokes. Yet, this was not a cruel joke. And when I left prison, he said to me, "You're free to go home to your mother's apartment, but this does not mean you are free to leave the country." It took another 10 days, occupied, I assumed, in resolving internal squabbling over my fate inside the security services before I was issued my passport. But on September 2, I was finally sitting on the plane of the tarmac of Tehran airport, watching impatiently as the hostess prepared for takeoff and watched close the aircraft door. This time, the sound of a door clicking shut signaled not confinement, but my return to my family, my friends, and my freedom. And as I looked out of the window, I said, "So long, Iran, not goodbye." Thank you.
All I can say is welcome back.
Thank you.
Hala has agreed to take a few questions. The young lady in the back. Please give your name.
I'm Manaz Afghami, Women's Learning Partnership, an old colleague of Hale. Hale Jan, thank you for this inspiring presentation. I hope I can ask my questions without emotion. But I saw your interrogation, began looking at it with a really heavy heart and worried. But it was really a very dignified and beautiful presentation of just exactly what you did in your life. There was nothing in it that I thought was in any way something that was not worthy of you. Now my question, how did you manage that? You've described your activities and all that, but I've seen so many men in the last few months who have come to these situations, and they have one way or the other broken down or have said things that one knows not to be true. How did you do it? Was it the Pilates? Was it the writing of the books in your head? Or was it, as my occupational hazard would indicate, just the extraordinary strength of a woman activist from Iran who has been at this kind of thing one way or the other for 30 years? Thank you.
Thank you, Mahnaz. Mahnaz was my boss when I was working in the women's organization, and she was the first and only minister for women's affairs when we had in Iran. Two reasons, really. One was that I constantly comfort myself by telling myself that I'm 67 years old. I had a wonderful life behind me. I had a very good career. I was very proud of myself to having made it again when we came with basically with empty hand to the United States. That was one thing. Secondly, the nature of my work at the Wilson Center was very transparent, and I just did not have to worry to hide things from them. So when they started approaching me with, the idea of me speaking on camera, and they were telling me that if you give this interview, we'll let you go immediately, And there had been a previous incident where an inmate who had given this interview was allowed to leave for home and then the country. But I started to bargain with them. First of all, I said, I don't expect me to use political science jargon in Persian because I don't know anything. I can't even understand what you say. A couple of times they had to go and ask Kian Tajbakhsh what the equivalent of English is, and then they would come and tell me, we mean this or that. That was one. And secondly, I said, I'm going to repeat on camera what I had said in private to you. But still, as I said, it was a terrible moment because I had seen in pre- and post-revolution Iran friends being forced to confess. I refused to see the program until maybe 2 months after I returned, and I noticed that they had spliced and they had put in. But somehow you develop a tactic, and that's it. Thank you.
Questions? Yes. In front.
Hala, I wonder if you could tell us your reaction when President Ahmadinejad removed the intelligence minister. And one of the reasons he gave for doing this was because how dare you put a 60, I think he said 70-year-old woman
70,
in jail and seemed to be very outraged by how you'd been treated. Do you think he knew all along what was going on, and why did he do this?
Yeah. I was told when I was still outside prison and being taken for interrogation to the intelligence ministry, I was told, I was never able to verify that my file, there are 2 copies of the file. One is on the desk of the then Minister of Intelligence, Ejei, and the other one is on the file, on the table of Mr. Ahmadinejad. So Ahmadinejad was quite aware of my case, and as we know, and it's now public knowledge, Mr. Hamilton had written to President Ahmadinejad, and Ahmadinejad did not even bother to reply. So of course he was aware of, and I think nothing else occurred to him when he fired the Minister of Intelligence 3 weeks ago to say that rather than arresting that 70-year-old woman, you should have gone and found the real culprit. Yeah.
Yes.
As you know, President Ahmadinejad is coming to New York again for the UN General Assembly. He has, the mission to the UN, or the Foreign Ministry, has invited some academics, think tankers, to come to what is an annual dinner when Ahmadinejad comes to the UN. What would you say to those people who've received invitations? Should they accept them and go and raise the issues of what has happened in Iran since June the 12th and what happened to you, or should they refuse to go?
Barbara, I think it's a very personal decision. I know that one of my very dear colleagues at the Wilson Center has declined the invitation, and I'm very proud of what he did. But I also have other colleagues who believe that talking and bringing these matters up with him would be beneficiary. It really is a personal decision, but I know that I personally would have not been able to go to such a meeting, but luckily I don't have to make a choice. I was not invited.
Yes. In the middle. Please state your name.
Trudy Rubin from the Philadelphia Inquirer,
Yeah.
and the book is wonderful.
Thank you, Trudy.
Hala, you mentioned that what we're seeing now is the same mindset and twisted logic being played out in all of these arrests. What do you think that the U.S. government and the non-governmental community can and should be doing to try to help those who are under arrest? And do you think that talking unconditionally at this time is detrimental to the internal situation, might be constituted as a betrayal by some people there, or do you think that it's a necessary undertaking no matter what the impact on the internal situation?
Trudy, you have known me for many years, and you know that even when I got out of Iran, and 3 days later I gave a press conference with Mike here at the Wilson Center, and I said, engage, talk to Iran. You need to talk to Iran. But these are unusual times. I mean, you know, we know what is going on in Iran, and I think a bit of restraint maybe would have helped. But the United States and the European have decided to talk to the Iranians, and I'm sure, you know, that knowing this administration, they will bring up the human rights issues, and I think this is fantastic. But also, Trudy, the intelligence ministry is now run and almost taken over by the Revolutionary Guards, and I think the more extreme elements in the intelligence ministry are running the prisons and having these forced confession and trials. But the confessions have become so discredited in Iran, nobody pays any attention to them.
Yes, second row.
Hallie, welcome back. Elliot Sorrell, Woodrow Wilson Council, and George Washington University. I've been impressed over the years with the extraordinary talent of Iranian women and all other women in the Middle East who are now beginning to speak up more often and in more countries. I wonder to what extent you envision the role of women in transforming that part of the world, educationally, politically, and otherwise. Thank you very much.
Actually, Iranian women have been talking, I think, for maybe the last 70 years, and they never stopped talking. And they have been pushing for reform and change, and especially in the last 30 years, because a lot of their rights were taken away from them. But there is an awareness in the region because of the level of education, because we have more educated women, that they would like to have more or less the same rights as men, and they have been pushing for change. If you look across the region, we have ministers in most of the countries, we have deputy ministers. It's very important to have them, you know, it's not tokenism, but it does make a big difference. They are role models for the rest of the women. And I think the hope of the region depends on the women.
Mike?
We received a couple of questions from an overflow room, and I just thought one of them, Hala might respond to it. Question: moderates in Iran trying to speak on your behalf stopped immediately when news of a $75 million funding program to disrupt the regime was announced for fear of retaliation. What lessons do you take from this for the next Hala Esfandiari victim in Iran?
First of all, I hope there won't be a next Hala Esfandiari victim in Iran. It wasn't a good time for her. Secondly, I think it did harm. I mean, the previous administration's policy regarding allocating $75 million to promote democracy in Iran was not appreciated nor welcomed by NGOs, because they believe that they were much more effective without any support coming from the outside world. And I think so far the Obama administration's policy of, in a way, restrain incremental steps, reaching out and being very cautious and not getting involved in the election debates and has been very effective. And I think we just should wait and see and to see what the Iranian NGOs want us to do. But this does not mean that we should not talk about human rights violation and atrocities that goes on in Iran.
Let's take two more questions. Gentleman in the back.
Thank you. I'm Jack Stripling. I'm a reporter with Inside Higher Ed. I wanted to ask you what you would say to scholars who, after viewing your experience, are reluctant to go to Iran and study there and do work in that country.
American scholars? Or general scholars?
Or Iranian folks in your own position who have the opportunity to go back. Yeah.
It's very difficult to answer. I have very strong feelings for Iran, and just saying that don't visit Iran, don't go back to Iran breaks my heart. But I think these are not normal conditions and not normal times. And I would wait a little bit and see how things will develop and then decide whether it's the right time to go or not.
Let me take one more question. The gentleman in the back.
Hi, my name is Jason Sturm from the Project on Middle East Democracy. And I'd like to ask you, referring back to the women's movement in Iran, how do you interpret President Ahmadinejad's nomination of 3 women to the cabinet and the eventual confirmation of one, the health minister?
This was not an innovative measure. Before the revolution, we had 2 women ministers. So appointing a woman was already as a member of the cabinet was, in my opinion, 30 years too late. They should have done it immediately after the revolution, but the woman they appointed is a very conservative person, and she even toyed with the idea of segregating medical treatment for men and women when she was a member of parliament. But having said that, I think it makes it's a welcome step. It sets a precedent that you can have women ministers in the Islamic Republic.
Thank you so much. As someone commented in the audience, it's a wonderful book. And,
Thank you. Thank you.
We are going to have a book signing. So stay in your seats until Hala leaves the room.
I go from the back.
She will be in the boardroom signing books, and we thank you all for coming. I think it was a marvelous
There is
afternoon.
a reception.
There's a book signing in the Moynihan boardroom, and there is a reception in the dining room. You're all welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.